Hello and welcome back again to Everyday Ordinary. I'm still Josh, and I look forward to sharing just a couple of minutes with you, with your time and with God's presence, both here with us and here with you, wherever you're at. And that's what we talked about last week, was God's continual presence through the power and the work of His Holy Spirit. This week, though, what I'd like to talk with you about is not God's power within us and to us, but God's power within us and through us. I would like you to understand that the book of Acts is really a two-part work. Inasmuch as Luke had his work in the Gospel of Luke, which bears his name, and he had the history of the church and the growth of the church in the book of Acts, the book of Acts really should be understood as two particular sections. The first section is chapters 1 through 12, which help us to see a picture of what it looked like for God, through the power of His Holy Spirit, the presence of His Spirit within His people, the church, the apostles, and the disciples, to work through them in loving their Jewish community. You see, where the church was born was not in America, it wasn't in China or Australia. It was, in fact, born in first century Israel. And so the people that the church was made up of was most certainly began with Jews. People who knew the promise of the Messiah, who had the hope of eternity bound up within their culture, their laws, their hearts. And so when Jesus fulfilled that, they looked forward to Him ultimately restoring Israel. And that ultimate restoration, though they thought it initially to be a physical kingdom on earth, they came to understand it as a spiritual kingdom in which they were now a part of because of their restoration to God, their sins being forgiven through the work of Jesus and through the indwelling presence of God's Holy Spirit. They went out and they were the witnesses to Jerusalem, Judea, and even into Samaria, a region that they would previously have disregarded, have put away because of the cultural and the ethnic strife that was existing between those two groups of people, the Jews and the Samaritans. And that's chapters 1 through 12. What we also should know about that is that Peter was the spokesperson, Jesus's apostle, in which he said, "Upon this rock, Peter, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." Peter was the spokesperson, he was the front runner, he was the man in charge, and he was excited to be doing that most of the time. Of course, he had his failures like any of us do, but that shift occurs in chapters 12 and 13 to where we no longer see God's power at work through the apostles to love particularly the Jewish community. But in chapters 13 through 28, we begin to see God at work through the apostles, namely Paul now, to love the Gentile world. Now, this is a big change, but it's a continued effort of Luke to account for the fulfilling of Jesus' words in which he said, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." So part 1 covers the first 3 locations, Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, but part 2 begins to cover the rest of the world, the known world, of course. And so this gospel propagation, what's accounted throughout Luke's work in 13 through 28, is the work of Paul, empowered by God's Holy Spirit, to plant churches, to grow and to build disciples, to place leaders, as he did with Timothy and with Titus, in different communities, to stand up gospel-centered and Christ-viewing leadership in their communities, within synagogues where Paul would go first, and then he would move outside of the synagogues and preach to all who would listen. But there's something that Acts doesn't do, because it's a history book and it accounts for what happened. Acts does not give us part 3. Part 3 is what I would like for you and I to understand as our today, our everyday, and our ordinary. Knowing that God is the God of the possible, that He takes things that seem impossible and makes them possible, that the incarnation brings Him to us in physical form. And then we know that as He died and was resurrected, we have the ongoing presence of His Holy Spirit. But we don't have to wish that we were in first century Jerusalem. We don't have to wish that we were in Corinth in the first century, as the other Jewish believers there would have heard, nor do we have to wish that we lived during the time of Paul, because we live during the time of Jesus' Spirit empowering believers, which is eternal. You and I have this power. You and I have a responsibility. That responsibility is that we are His witnesses every day in our ordinary lives, as we go to work, as we go to school, as we go to church, as we sit with our neighbors, as we barbecue, as we get upset, as we fail, and as we succeed. We are His witness. And we need to understand that the power of God's Holy Spirit allows us and gives us the great opportunity to witness properly for Him. My challenge for you is just that that as we live out our everyday ordinary, we would realize that we are living out this idea of a part 3 of the book of Acts, in which God's work continues to spread throughout the entire world, and it does so through you. We'll talk soon.